Hi guys, it's Gico here once again, and I've just had a really tip-top interesting lesson this morning with my Year 12 students, where we've been looking at the whole notion of merit goods and whether or not merit goods such as health and education should be provided free at the point of access by the state, or whether or not we should all have to pay in some way, shape or form for these things. And so for the benefit of my students who were missing this morning because they were out doing various things, and also for the benefit of all you people out there who are subscribers, I want to just go over and just run a few things by you. This tends to be a very topical area for exam questions, especially essay questions, be that either AS or A2. So let's just have a look at this and let me bring to your attention some of the things which my students were talking about this morning. So we were primarily considering, in our lesson this morning, considering education. But the most common exam questions tend to focus either on education or the provision of healthcare by the state, by the National Health Service. Now, as I've said, these are free at the point of access or free at the point of consumption. Now, obviously, there is the case that they are financed through taxation, but whenever you and I walk into our local hospital, our local A&E, we do not have to pay up every time we go in. We just go in and we're treated. What a privilege that is. And so the price is zero to us when we are there consuming it. And I want to just talk you through this diagram and maybe analyse this and make a few shifts here and there just to explain what the problems are with having this service, this tremendous either healthcare or education service free at the point of access. So let's take the notion of healthcare first of all. Healthcare, of course, is provided by the government, and there are a limited number of hospitals in the country. And so as a consequence, the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. It's relatively fixed. And indeed, if you wanted to build more hospitals, that is not an overnight fix. And so even in this medium term, the supply curve, the elasticity of it would still be relatively inelastic, although obviously over time becomes more elastic. You'll know that from your studies of elasticity. And here we have a demand curve. Now, were this the case that you had to pay for your healthcare, then of course this would be the equilibrium price across here. But it's free at the point of consumption, and therefore the price is zero. Now the problem that creates is, here we have the quantity demanded where the price is zero, and here we have the quantity supplied where the price is zero. And as you can see, demand is bigger than supply, and so we get this problem, which you will be familiar with, I'm sure, known as excess demand. Now in the health service, how is that solved? The way it's solved is you go onto a waiting list. And so if you are unlucky enough to be in one of these slots here, as it were, then you will find yourself on a waiting list. Now, of course, this is a problem because of the way in which the NHS, the National Health Service, is run. And so one could almost describe this as a form of government failure, because it is the government, way back in the late 40s, 1940s, early 50s, who introduced this system. Okay. Now let's think about education, which is specifically what my class were thinking about this morning. Again, the same problem arises. Supply inelastic, certain number of schools, this is the demand, and so on. So for example, here at my school for the coming September 2017, there are 220 places in Year 7. We had a number of students come for aptitude assessments, probably around the 450 mark. So the quantity demanded was much greater than the quantity supplied. And so 230 or so of those students will be very disappointed not to get into their first choice school when the letters go out in March. Now, there are other problems associated with being an outstanding school. So Ofsted, of course, which grades schools, and the official watchdog, as it were, grades schools. And obviously, the demand for good schools is high. But as more and more people, for example, locate around a good school because they want to join the catchment area and get their little kiddie winkles into the school, then obviously the demand would shift as follows. The demand curve would shift possibly even further to the right. At the same time, public sector and state schools are feeling the squeeze in terms of finances.
Mr. Steer, please contact.
And as a consequence of that, number one, there will be less new schools built in the foreseeable, I guess. But number two, some schools might amalgamate with others, and so some schools will actually close down. And as a consequence of that, the demand curve, let me just put this in a different colour, the supply curve will be shifting to the left. And so we can see here that this problem of the excess demand is exacerbated because of the perhaps successful school status pulling demand, the demographic change, for example, in an area. If you've got lots of new people coming to an area or lots of people migrating to a certain area, putting pressure on local government services, that will increase the demand. And then at the same time, the government is thinking, all right, we've got this enormous budget deficit problem. We've got this enormous national debt, which we need to bring under control. What are a couple of our biggest areas of expenditure? Education and health. We're going to have to start slashing into these, reducing budgets, and that then shifts supply in this direction. And so the gap between the supply and the demand gets ever wider. Now, of course, if you wanted to use the market mechanism to solve this problem, then you would just say to people, okay, people, the solution is, unfortunately, that times are hard, you're going to have to pay to come to school. And so where demand meets supply, if we use the original S1 and D1, where demand meets supply, this would be the price, P star. And so you'll have to pay. Now, of course, then there are all sorts of issues with regard to, well, who could afford to pay? Is it fair to make everybody pay? What about the people who just simply cannot afford to pay? What would they do? Would they just go to the local sink schools where nobody else wanted to go to? So there are all sorts of equity issues here. And you can see, I hope you're starting to build a picture in your mind here of the problems associated with government policy on these big issues of public sector expenditure. So there are a few other things that I wanted to just mention, if I may, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just pull this across slightly so that you can see it. So we've mentioned the issue of waiting lists. We've mentioned the issue of demographics. We've mentioned the issue of Ofsted and the budget deficit. We've mentioned the issue of price as a rationing device. But is it right to use price as a rationing device? Because then there are all sorts of equity issues. So this is a really useful diagram to illustrate lots of concepts and then plenty of analysis that can go alongside it. Now, of course, you're probably shouting at the screen at the moment, but GECO, education is a merit good, i.e. there are spin-off benefits for the wider economy. And I agree, of course there are. And so perhaps, therefore, it's quite right and quite just that the government should be providing education due to the merit good nature of it. So let's just take a look at the merit goods diagram. You'll no doubt at AS be working through the externalities diagram, so you'll be familiar with these. So merit goods are things that the government deems to be good for us. So they, as our paternal, fatherly figure, think it's good for us to enjoy health and education and so on, healthcare and education. But they also know that because of information failure, because we as individuals, sometimes, especially young people such as yourselves, sometimes you don't enjoy going to school because you don't realise the wider benefits that brings to society if you are well educated. And as a consequence of that, if it was just left to you and to your own devices and to me and to my own devices, we would probably underconsume these merit goods, because we would only take into consideration our private benefits and ignore the broader social benefits. So I hope you're familiar, ladies and gentlemen, with this diagram with regard to positive consumption externality. So just to annotate this briefly, you'll know that if left to our own devices, this would be the quantity demanded and supplied, and this would be the price. But society's benefit is much greater than our own, and so really we should be producing and consuming Q2 units at a price of P2. Now, of course, you can see here the problem is that as we move from Q1 to Q2, the price is rising. And so the whole notion of price acting as a rationing device comes back to bite us here. And so the question is, how do we get Q2 level of consumption but make it more affordable for the everyday man on the street? And I hope you know that the solution to this is that we're going to introduce a subsidy. Now, the size of that subsidy, ladies and gentlemen, you will well know, the size of that subsidy will be taken from, first of all, we take it from Q2, because Q2 units is where we want to be. That's the allocatively efficient level. And the vertical distance between here and here, you will know that that needs to be the size of the subsidy. And the subsidy will lower a firm's costs of production, incentivize them to produce more, and consequently the marginal social cost curve, the MSC curve, will shift to the right, and we'll have a new MSC2 at this point. And we would then have a new price point of P3. And so effectively what's happened here is that the government have managed to achieve the optimal level of consumption, the allocatively efficient level, by use of this subsidy. And on this diagram at least, depends obviously on the elasticity of demand here, the price is now at a lower level than it originally was. A few key points about this diagram, ladies and gentlemen. The vertical distance here between the two curves, that is the subsidy per unit. Okay, that's the subsidy per unit. The total cost to the government of this subsidy is, of course, Q2 units times the subsidy per unit. It's that distance times that distance. So if we were trying to tell the examiner what the actual cost of the government is, it's from here to here to here to here. It's that rectangle. That is the total cost to the government of that subsidy. Now, in another video, I've looked at what, why it's difficult to assess the correct level of the subsidy. So I don't want to get into that here. Suffice to say that this subsidy is trying to measure the external benefit that it accrues to society as a consequence of more people consuming health and education. And of course you can, I'm sure you're thinking already of various problems with measuring that. But let's come back now to whether education should be provided by the private or the public sector. And there are a few things which I'd just like to talk about with regard to this diagram. So once again, there's a whole notion of equity. So surely it's right that the government provides it on the basis of equity and fairness and equal opportunity for all. I'm not saying a yay or nay to that, I'm just throwing that out there for you to think about. Secondly, some people would argue that if you have to pay for something yourself, generally speaking, you're more appreciative of it. So those of you, for example, who are thinking about university, the big thing, of course, one of the big things is your tuition fees. When I went to university, I was very lucky and I didn't have to pay. And so I was probably a little bit less worried about missing a lecture and a tutorial than you might be, because you are having to foot the bill for it. So some people would argue, well, it's right that you should pay because you will treat it better and you will think more of it and you'll be more grateful for it and you are more likely to attend. Again, we've seen this with university tuition fees. I'll come back to the voucher scheme at the end because there's another thing I wanted to talk about with regard to that. Some people would argue, well, if you have to pay for it, then you will know that who drives demand, who is sovereign. It will be the wealthiest will be driving demand. And so the wealthiest would have the greatest impact on the education curriculum and therefore might drive and steer the direction of the curriculum. Again, that's just something for you to think about. What about the quality? Some people would also say that the quality of your education might be better if your parents are having to pay for it and the school is under an obligation, obviously, to make sure that you're getting value for money. And so if there were any problems in the area of teaching or anything along those lines, then perhaps you might get a more instantaneous and more responsive system if you, as the customer, as it were paying for it. Discuss. And again, I've talked about the responsiveness here. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say about this would be, well, childcare, for example, there's a voucher scheme and you get vouchers for childcare. Some people would say, well, why don't we give people on an income threshold, so below a certain income, why don't we give them vouchers which would entitle them to maybe choose to go to maybe the private school up the road rather than the state school nearby? It's just something worth thinking about. And I was just thinking about this myself, and I was having a little look on BBC just at break time today, and I just came across this. This is just up today, 43 minutes ago. As you can see, private schools plan 10,000 free places for low-income pupils. So there's a great article there, which I'll put a link to on this video and tweet that one out later as well. So all sorts to think about here with regard to how the government deals with the provision of these very, very expensive public services. I think it's a really fascinating aspect of economics, and I hope you do too. Bye for now, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, no live audience today. I'm disappointed. I did enjoy that the other day. But see you again next time.